so much going on with Tua Tagovailoa and what went on. I'm sure everybody knows the situation with that. And I want to go a little more general because I come from an era where really if you put up two fingers and you said three and you were close, you went back in the game. And we know it's different now. And we also know it's going to change again. I think the league and the union have already said some of the wording is going to change. And I know you've talked about this a lot, if you were given the right to change what it needs to be or what direction you think it needs to go in, what would you say on how teams, union, independent neurologists, and all that should be dealing with concussions on game day?
Mike, it's such a long answer because it's complicated, right? And you've probably heard me say this over the last few days, but the one thing about concussion that makes this more problematic than any other injury we encounter is that there is no definitive diagnostic test for it. And that means that in order to arrive at the diagnosis of concussion, absent two things, there are two things, loss of consciousness and a fencing response or posture, which is what people saw with Tua in that Thursday night game. That was very startling because it's very dramatic when it happens. Those are two observable signs that automatically there's a diagnosis of concussion. But absent those, it's really a constellation of findings, right? There's some objective testing, neurologic testing you could put players through. There's a lot of question and answer. There's memory testing. And based on the results of this battery of tests and the interview with the player, you arrive at a diagnosis of concussion or not. Without a definitive diagnostic test, that means you're relying a lot on professional judgment. And while people may be extremely well qualified, we all know there's potential for error, human error, when it comes to relying on judgment. So to answer your question, I think the big picture fix, ideally, is get more objective testing. And science is working towards that. There's things being studied like biomarkers, where you look at certain proteins in the blood or saliva to determine if there's been a concussion, for example. There are eye tracking devices because we talk about in medicine the eyes being a window to the brain. Eye function is often an indicator of brain function. And so there are things that are out there that are in process, but nothing that's been widely adopted or universally accepted. And that's partially because science takes time. You know, the media and awareness is ahead of the science. So that's not a quick resolution. And in the situation we're talking about here, everybody's looking for quick changes. So what can we do to help in an area where we know it's going to be imperfect anyway? And that always means more clarity. I think we need the results of the investigation to see where the mistakes were made to best respond to that. Because if we don't know where the errors exactly happened along the way, it's hard to say exactly what to fix. But I will say this, we've already heard that the term gross motor instability is a subject of discussion. So what does that mean? Fine motor is usually like little coordination things, like, if you're a piano player, fine motor coordination, all the little movements of the fingers. But gross motor is walking, standing, things like that, things that are really easily visible to the average layman. And if you have gross motor instability, you're unstable while doing those things. The problem is you can have an orthopedic cause for gross motor instability. So if you tore your ACL and you try to run on it, you might be unstable and fall down. If you have a head injury, that can trigger gross motor instability because of a neurological cause. And that's why it's framed in the concussion protocol as gross motor instability with the little footnote that neurologically induced. I think what we are likely to see happen, since we're hearing about changes coming, is that if this gross motor instability is visible, we're just going to pull the player off the field and not try to establish that diagnosis, because the other problematic thing about concussions is sometimes the real signs and symptoms don't declare themselves until hours or days later. So it's in asking, like, trying to fix it, I always go back to let's take it as much out of the judgment realm as possible, but understand that's a long-term solution. It's a big picture fix. I think the smaller things now are going to be clarification of wording, probably erring on the side of caution or conservatism, and that's going to depend on what the review finds and the reaction to that.
So when we see a player enter the concussion protocol and then not pass it and not be able to come back into the game, what exactly does that mean? And is that something that you can use as a diagnostic tool?
Well, that's kind of what they are using now. And so just to walk you through what the process looks like, and I also, it's a little confusing because there's a game day protocol, which is all if there's an evaluation that's triggered by seeing somebody who appears injured, they then go into that game day protocol for screening and determination of whether they can return to play. If they are deemed to have a concussion, they enter the concussion protocol that they then have to work through in order to get back to play. That's the post game over the following week or weeks, etc. So we're talking strictly about the game day protocol here as far as your question. And essentially what happens is if somebody exhibits signs or reports symptoms of a concussion, that protocol gets triggered. And it can be triggered by anyone, by the player, by people who are on the sidelines, the spotters up in the booth, the UNC's unaffiliated neurotrauma consultant who can be on the ground or up in the sky. The referee can trigger it. Anybody who witnesses something that they deem should be evaluated can trigger it. And then that player is escorted by the medical personnel to typically the medical blue tent, where there's a screening process that happens. A series of questions, a basic, more limited neurological exam, and in that time frame in the blue tent, if it's suspicious that they might have a head injury going on, they then go to the locker room for a more detailed exam. Now, when we saw Tua go straight away to the locker room, that was because there were signs exhibited, the stumbling included, that meant they were going to go straight to the locker room for the complete neurological exam. And that is basically more detailed questioning, some balance testing, mobility testing, a more detailed neurological exam, an opportunity to look at orthopedic injuries. And then based on those findings, if they do not find things that are suggestive of a concussion, they can clear the player to return to play. If they do find things suggestive of a concussion, then the player's out for the remainder of the game. And I will add one more thing. If they do return the player to play, if they've been evaluated for a head injury, it doesn't end there. They are to observe the player. If he goes back in for a series, comes off, they're to repeat some of the questioning, make sure they're doing okay. They're then evaluated at the end of the game. They're then evaluated the next day. And so technically, it should not end even if a player's returned to play.
Stephania, we've heard a few people talk about these no-go symptoms and that should have prevented Tua from getting back out on the field after he was stumbling, like you said. What are those? Is that the fencing, the loss of consciousness? Is that kind of in that bucket?
Right. So I'll tell you what the no-go signs are. It's the loss of consciousness, the fencing posture, confusion, amnesia. Like, for example, amnesia, forgetting things. They'll often ask a player, what was the play that just happened? If they appear disoriented to time or place. And that's right there on the field when the medical personnel approach them. They're asking questions to get at that. And then the final one is gross motor instability with that asterisk of if it's deemed to be neurologically induced. So those are the no-go. And the reason the asterisk is by the gross motor instability is there's no way to determine if it's neurologically induced until you go through the subsequent review.
Yeah, and as you said, and as I think we all know is going to happen, that asterisk is going to be gone. And if you stumble at all, you're going to be out, whether it's a different injury or not. A couple of other procedural things about this. And again, we weren't in the room when this went on, again, Sunday against the Bills in that one. But the union has already stepped in and fired the unaffiliated neurotrauma consultant for some of the procedural things. From what I understand, you could explain the process better, to let the player get back on the field, don't both the UNC and the team doctor have to unanimously agree, which means Tua went back on the field, which means the team doctor had to agree with that as well. So, and I know we have to wait for this investigation, but I'm wondering if something is going to have to come down with that person as well.
It's a fair question. I don't think, like you said, we won't know until they've gone back and reviewed all the steps. But you are correct that the people who go into the locker room for the full exam, and by the way, if there's any evaluation of a head injury, the UNC like if it was a preliminary screen in the blue tent, the UNC would be there as well as a member of the Dolphins medical staff. Now, it's typically an athletic trainer or a team physician. I don't know who was the member of the Dolphins staff who went into the locker room with the UNC, but presumably one of the team physicians. And I think it's important to first explain for people who might not be aware, there are multiple team physicians for a team, and they have different areas of specialty. So there might be a head team physician who's an orthopedic surgeon. There might be a head team physician who's a medical, primary care team physician who often has responsibilities in this area of head injuries as well. And sometimes those roles are shared as head team physicians. So we don't know who went as a member of the Dolphins medical staff, but there would be a representative of the Dolphins, representative being the UNC who's unaffiliated. And as Dr. Sills, the chief medical officer, explained when I spoke with him last week, I was asking him to describe for people exactly what the role of the UNC is, because the question you're asking is the one a lot of people are asking. And he said, they felt it was important, and reminder that these protocols are jointly agreed upon by the NFL and the NFLPA. So, and when they crafted these protocols, to have somebody who's familiar with the player, because that person is better able to potentially judge subtle changes in behavior, personality. We see that with brain injury sometimes, where somebody might just be off, not acting like themselves. And the unaffiliated person might not pick that up because they're not accustomed to the player. So the idea was to have somebody who's familiar, somebody who's unfamiliar, who would come in with no knowledge of the player, no investment, and might be better prepared to be extremely objective, shall we say. And also the UNC has the board certification, board training in neurology or neurosurgery. And so they jointly evaluate the player, and then, yes, they confer. It's supposed to be, a collegial conversation, but what I am told is that if there is any discrepancy or disagreement between the two, the judgment always lies with the more conservative approach. And so if somebody were to say, well, I'm not comfortable because of X, Y, or Z, that would be the overriding conclusion.
So everybody seems to want, when this happened, this cut and dry yes or no, which we know because there isn't even a cut and dry for a concussion diagnosis, we're going to get a yes or no. So I had this situation. I was calling the Tampa Bay Kansas City game. And the one thing we always talk about is player involvement. And I know as a player, and I know the high majority of players will try and hide whatever they can to get back on the field. Now, so you could say the player, listen, it's their own fault at times. And listen, it is. You do what you have to at times to get back on the field, which sometimes isn't the smartest decision. So in that game, Cameron Brate, the tight end for the Buccaneers, caught a pass, and I was watching this real time, and he ran into his own guy, and it was coming toward the end of the half, and he got up slow. He didn't have any gross motor instability, but he jogged off the field slowly. You couldn't really tell if it was a head or what it was. He came off the field, and he said it was his shoulder. 2 plays, like play or two later, he went back on the field. He didn't even get examined. He didn't even go in the blue tent.
The easy part is to say there will be some gray areas. That I am very confident in, because this is an imperfect science at this point. Until we have the diagnostic and we can know it in real time, it's going to be impossible. But, and I haven't seen this exact play, but I have heard the conversation around it. So I have not seen it myself on tape, but I've heard the conversation around it. As far as the eyes on the field, that is why they added the addition of an athletic trainer spotter in the booth. There's also one of the UNCs in the booth who specifically has access to video to review. And the idea is that they can communicate down to the sideline immediately. So if they see something, and from being around football, it's so busy on the sideline. Sometimes we watch at home and we think, how could they not see that? But we're looking at these camera angles that are up and above, and often the personnel on the sideline, they might be just blocked by other players, or sometimes they're tending to someone else. So the idea was, if we put 2 people upstairs, they have the ability to look down and survey the field, and they can immediately radio down to the referee and call for a medical timeout. So since that didn't happen, I don't know if nobody saw anything that they thought was warranted or if they just didn't see anything at all. Who is to say? But if the player doesn't identify that and nobody saw it, then you're living in that gray space. What I would say, though, is at least he did ultimately report something. They screened it, and then he was held up. So that's the idea, is that it's supposed to ultimately work that way. There are some, I don't know if fail safe is the right word, but some little safety nets built in. And as I said, when we started this, even if somebody clears the concussion protocol, that game day protocol, they go through the test, they're cleared to return. The eyes are more focused on that player going forward to make sure that things don't change. We still hear about already this year, Alec Pierce, wide receiver for the Colts, reported concussion symptoms a day after the game. He didn't go into the protocol until at least 24 hours after. Nobody saw anything. He didn't feel anything, but a day or so later, he complains of headaches, and he missed the subsequent game because of being in the concussion protocol. The NFL also posts injury data that they share with us at the end of the year. They're obviously looking at numbers of concussions and monitoring head impacts. They have video that they use throughout the offseason to then review all the head impacts and make determinations about. In some cases, that's what's led to rule changes, for example, on special teams and so forth. But they try to correlate what they see on video with players who reported concussion or concussions that were determined even after the fact, to see where they're picking things up, where they might be missing things. So it's a constant area that's being studied to see how can we best identify these when they happen and hopefully not have to wait until later. But it's also true that sometimes the symptoms don't declare themselves until hours or even days later. Within 48 hours is usually about the right time. But again, that very nebulous nature of when the symptoms appear is part of the issue.
One more question on Tua and concussions. I know it's probably pretty difficult to speculate on it while just watching TV at home, but when you did see the initial hit and then he got up and stumbled and then went into the locker room, what was your reaction? Were you thinking, I definitely just saw him get a concussion, or maybe it's, what they said about the back injury?
So having worked in this area of medicine before and treated a number of athletes who've suffered concussion, and just knowing how different everything looks, I'm pretty much a wait and see person. I will admit that when I saw it and I saw him stumble, I was like, well, he's got to be evaluated. Like, my first thought is he's got to be evaluated. And when I saw him escorted off the field with the medical personnel, I was like, okay, this is what's supposed to happen. And I kind of didn't think much about it. If you recall, that was not long before the half. And they went straight to the locker room. So I was thinking to myself, oh, good. They're taking him straight to the locker room. That's going to be a full neurological eval. And then we'll see what happens. And I probably assumed he'd be out, but I'm not taking that as a judgment, just more patterns that you see. And then when he returned, I remember thinking, oh, okay, well, maybe there was something I missed. Maybe it was, that's how your mind works. Maybe it was orthopedic. They must have felt that he was cleared. They must have gone through the process and felt that it wasn't actually a concussion after all, and blah, blah, blah. And then I heard the thing about the back and the ankle. I did see some still shots later of him getting, just a couple plays prior, twisted up right at the goal line where he got bent backwards and twisted. Somebody had fallen on his ankle and he was actually hyperextended and rotated. Those things can cause back and ankle injuries. And you have to remember, he had a very serious hip injury right before he was drafted, and has subsequently a little bit less mobility in that hip. So that means his back is at more risk of getting hurt. And that there are a lot of things, right? So when I heard back and ankle with that, I thought, okay. And I just trusted the process. Now, this is where the investigation is going to lay out for us what happened and how they arrived at that conclusion. I will say that in subsequent conversations with the league during the process of the investigation, they did confirm that he indeed had orthopedic issues, back and ankles. So they're not mutually exclusive, right? You could have all of them, but the danger, I would say, and I think this is important, about relying solely on video evidence is that most concussions don't look like that. Most concussions are invisible to us. Mike, perhaps you could, I mean, the guys who play on the line take repeated impacts at a sub-threshold level that may or may not do anything in real time, but every so often there's one that it is a concussive event, but nobody recognizes it because it's not dramatic. It's not, you are not able to see something on video that anyone as a layperson would go, aha, that was a concussion. And my concern is that if we go, oh, well, I know that when I see it, then you're ignoring the vast majority of them, which don't look anything like that. And we also know that the presentation of symptoms doesn't necessarily correlate with how dramatic the injury appeared to be. So I would just ask everyone to keep that in mind as they consider this going forward, because I hear it a lot where people talk about, well, are we getting soft in the NFL, or that guy, nothing really happened to him. He seemed fine. Why is he out for 3 weeks? Well, that guy who looked like he just got a bare tap on the helmet, he might still have difficulty riding in a car because he's still motion sensitive from that concussion. They really are a difficult injury to navigate, and we're still in the infancy as far as the science is concerned. So I think we have to be still prepared that even if we make improvements to the rules, and there are always improvements to be made, and I'm glad that the NFL and the NFLPA are grinding through this. It's important. But is it going to be perfect after this? Nope.